In 2001, Apple did something insane. They had no experience in music, no market share, and no backup plan. And yet, they built a device that rewrote the music industry and helped pull a company back from the edge. This wasn't just a gadget, it was the beginning of a cultural shift that no one saw coming. But how did a company known only for computers manage to change music forever? Back in the late 90s, Apple was struggling. The company had barely escaped bankruptcy, and the only thing keeping it alive was the Mac. That was it. No iPhones, no iPads, no wearables, just beige computers and Steve Jobs' belief that Apple still had one more comeback left in it. At the time, Apple had just introduced FireWire to the iMac, a high-speed connection that let you edit digital videos on your Mac. This was the start of Apple's digital hub strategy. The Mac would be at the center of your creative universe, but something was missing: music. This was a weird time for music. CDs were king, MP3s were rising fast, and Napster had just kicked the music industry in the teeth. People were illegally downloading music left and right. Record labels were in full panic mode. But one thing was clear: digital music was the future, whether the industry liked it or not. Steve Jobs, well, he saw this shift and jumped in. In early 2001, Apple launched iTunes, its own digital music player and CD burner for the Mac. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. You could rip your CDs, burn your own mixes, and manage your music in one place. iTunes was the software piece, now they needed hardware. MP3 players were everywhere in the early 2000s, and they were all terrible. Clunky interfaces, weak storage, slow as molasses. Most could barely fit 12 songs, and transferring music took forever with USB 1.1. One album took about 5 minutes. Try doing that 50 times. Steve Jobs saw the gap and knew Apple could do better. He turned to hardware chief John Rubinstein, who had a vision: combined FireWire's blazing speed with Toshiba's brand new 5GB 1.8-inch hard drive. That alone would crush the competition, but Apple didn't have enough engineers to make it happen. So, Rubinstein called up Tony Fadell, a handheld device veteran from General Magic and Philips, who had just wrapped up a failed startup trying to build a music gadget. Fadell got a 6-week contract. No clear brief, just figure out how we build this. He prototyped 3 versions using foam and fishing weights, and in April 2001 pitched them to Jobs, hiding the best one under a bamboo bowl. Of course, Steve picked that one. Project greenlit and clock ticking, Apple gave Fadell a skeleton crew. Some from his old team, some from Philips, and 6 months to deliver. They were crammed into a rundown building on campus. A battery exploded during testing and sparked a literal fire. Welcome to iPod development. Still, piece by piece, it came together. Portal Player handled MP3 playback, Fostex helped build the iconic white earbuds, Jeff Robin retooled iTunes to sync with any device, and Joni Ives' team crafted a sleek design. White front, stainless steel back, moving scroll wheel, no buttons, no battery door, no screws, just clean, sealed perfection. Vinny Chayco named it iPod, inspired by sci-fi escape pods that dock to a hub, like the Mac. From nothing to product in 6 months, and it worked. This is where everything changed. October 2001. The world didn't know it yet, but Apple had just dropped a bomb, and it came in the form of a tiny white brick with a scroll wheel, the first iPod. On paper, it was 5 gigs of storage, a 2-inch monochrome display, 10-hour battery life, and a $399 price tag. But in real life, it felt like something from the future. You could carry 1,000 songs in your pocket. No skipping CDs, no fragile cassette tapes, no weird glitchy knockoff MP3 players, just you, your music, and that glorious little wheel. Apple paired it with iTunes and FireWire, so syncing your music was shockingly fast compared to the USB slogs other devices forced you through. This wasn't just a new gadget, it was a relationship with music. Simple, personal, cool. And Apple didn't stop. By 2004, the iPod Classic had a color display and up to 60 gigabytes of storage. That's 15,000 songs, photos, or album art. Basically a whole digital museum in your pocket. Then came the 6th generation in 2007, the final form of the Classic. 160 gigabytes of storage, a brighter 2.5-inch color screen, 40 hours of battery life, polished aluminum casing. This thing looked serious. It wasn't playful anymore. It was confident. A tank in your pocket that still had soul. For 6 straight years, it quietly dominated the music world. And in the process, it turned Apple into something much bigger than a computer company. In 2004, Apple asked, what if we made the iPod fun-sized? Enter the iPod mini, the younger, cuter sibling of the classic. This thing didn't just play music, it popped. Lime green, pink, blue, gold, silver. It looked like the iMac G3 had a baby with a Walkman. And people loved it. It had a 1.67-inch backlit screen, came with 4 gigabytes of storage, enough for about 1,000 songs, and had an 8-hour battery life. But the real showstopper is the click wheel. Unlike the older scroll wheel, this was a touch-sensitive surface with physical buttons built in. It was sleek, futuristic, weirdly addictive to spin. People would scroll just for the fun of it. Priced at $249, it wasn't exactly a bargain, but it felt more accessible than the chunky classics. By early 2005, Apple released a second-gen Mini, 6 gigabytes of storage, improved battery life, and even more saturated colors. And just when the Mini was the most popular MP3 player in the world, Apple killed it. No warning, no farewell. They discontinued the iPod Mini at its absolute peak. Why? Because they had something even crazier in the pipeline, thinner, flash-based, and ready to blow minds. Apple wasn't chasing trends, they were making them. The iPod Nano was Apple saying, yeah, we can go thinner. Watch this. When it dropped in 2005, people literally thought it was a joke. It was so slim, so polished, that it looked like a tech prototype someone accidentally left in a store. But it was real, and it was glorious. The original Nano came in black or white, had a 1.5-inch color screen, held 2 to 4 gigabytes of music, and gave you around 14 hours of playback. That's over 200 songs in something the thickness of a pencil. Instantly, it became a fashion statement. Celebrities wore them to interviews, kids clipped them to backpacks like badges of honor. You weren't just listening to music, you were showing off your taste. And Apple wasn't done. The Nano kept evolving like it had something to prove. By the 4th generation, it had a bigger 2-inch display, came in 9 bold colors, could play videos, and even had a built-in accelerometer, so you could just shake it to shuffle songs. It was like your music player had a personality. Then came 2010. The Nano went full sci-fi. Apple stripped off the click wheel and turned it into a tiny touchscreen square. It looked like a smartwatch, but back then, smartwatches weren't even a thing yet. People started wearing it as a wrist gadget. Then entire companies popped up just to sell Nano wristbands. And in 2012, Apple tried one last remix. The 7th gen Nano came with a 2.5-inch touchscreen, a little home button. Yes, just like a mini iPhone. 16 gigabytes of storage, Bluetooth, and even FM radio. It was thin, fast, and stylish. Because, by that point, the iPhone had already taken over most of what the Nano did. It was like the Nano was growing up just as people stopped needing it. Still amazing, but slowly fading into the background. The Nano wasn't just thin, it was iconic. A pocket-sized time capsule of Apple's wildest design years. The iPod Shuffle was released in 2005, and this was Apple saying, who needs a screen when you've got taste? It was the anti-iPod in the best way possible. The first Shuffle, it looked like a USB stick. No screen, just play, pause, and skip. It had 512 megabytes or a gig of storage, cost $99, and played songs in, well, shuffle mode. You couldn't choose what came next, you had to surrender to the chaos, and people actually loved that. Then came the clip-on models, tiny, sleek, and built like a fashion accessory. They came in multiple colors and were light enough to forget you were wearing them. Some versions introduced voiceover, where the shuffle whispered the song name to you. Others ditched all buttons entirely. You had to use Apple headphones with secret commands. It was futuristic and mildly frustrating. Then came the iPod Touch, and suddenly, music was just the beginning. Launched in 2007, the Touch didn't just look like the iPhone, it was the iPhone, without the SIM card. A sleek slab of glass and metal with a 3.5-inch multi-touch display, Wi-Fi, Safari, YouTube, and later the App Store. It wasn't just an iPod anymore, it was a pocket-sized computer. The first-gen Touch came in 8GB, 16GB, and 32GB variants, with around 22 hours of battery life. Starting at $299, it wasn't cheap, but it was powerful. You could watch movies, scroll the web, download games, and stream music, all without needing a cell plan. For a lot of kids and teens, this was their first iPhone. Apple kept evolving it. The 4th gen added front and back cameras. The 5th gen in 2012 brought a 4-inch Retina display, a 5-megapixel camera, and a 5 chip. It was fun, fast, and incredibly versatile. It became a favorite among gamers, TikTok pioneers, and anyone who wanted an Apple experience without the monthly bill. But after that, things slowed down. The 6th and 7th generations barely changed. Same small size, same aging design, just spec bumps, and honestly, no one noticed. It felt like Apple had moved on. And in 2022, they made it official. The iPod Touch and the entire iPod family was discontinued. No big keynote, no dramatic send-off, just a quiet goodbye to the device that wants to find portable media for a generation. But let's not forget, the iPod Touch wasn't a downgrade, it was the bridge between Apple's past and future. Music player, gaming console, mini computer, it wore a lot of hats, and it wore them well. In the end, the iPod was replaced by something Apple made themselves, the iPhone. It could do everything the iPod could, but also text, call, stream, take photos, browse the web, and run apps. It wasn't just a music player, it was everything. And that's what killed the iPod. Over time, fewer people needed a separate device just for music. Apple knew this. That's why updates to the iPod slowed down and eventually stopped. The iPhone became the future, and the iPod became history. But here's the thing, without the iPod, there wouldn't be an iPhone. The scroll wheel walked so the touchscreen could run, and for a generation of users, the iPod wasn't just a gadget. It was the beginning of a new kind of personal tech, simple, beautiful, and powerful. So, while the iPod is gone, its legacy is in your pocket, still playing music, still changing the world.